Guys, I'm currently in Hopwas Woods, at the witches' table. Just now, I'd usually have a little clear up before I start filming, but I've got about 10 minutes before it starts to get dark, so realistically I just don't have time, unfortunately. But yeah, anyway, the witches' table, let's get into it, guys.
If you walk through Hopwas Woods today, there's nothing about it that makes you stop or question anything around you. Quiet, opening places and absolutely gorgeous. But in the summer of 1984, this area became the centre of a story that quickly moved beyond Tamworth and international attention. Not because of what was proven, but because of how it was reported, and more importantly, how it was remembered. Because one night just after midnight, police were called to what had been described as strange goings on in the woods. And when they arrived, they found 16 men and women gathered around a fire, stark bollock naked, chanting and dancing together as part of what was described at the time as an occult ritual. A scene that even without any context would have been enough to raise questions. And almost immediately, the word that became attached to them was witches. A label that appeared early and spread quickly, picked up by local newspapers and then amplified further, until journalists and television crews were making their way towards Tamworth in search of what had already been framed as the witches of Hopwas Woods. But when you look at what was actually said by the people involved, and not just how they were described, the story becomes far less clear-cut. Because the man at the centre of it, Mr. James Lees, was very direct in saying that they weren't witches, and strongly objected to the way that they'd been portrayed. Instead, he described the group as occultists, part of something known as the Order of the Silver Star, and said that what they were doing that night was, in his own words, harmless. Although the reasoning behind it was far more complex than that single word suggests. According to Lees, the ritual itself was not a spontaneous gathering, but part of a sequence that had been carried out over a number of years. And on that particular night, they believed they were acting to prevent a major disaster that they felt was due to happen later that year. Although what that disaster was supposed to be was never clearly explained, but it had something to do with the planet Pluto. Baffling, mate. He also described how the ritual was structured, with members forming into a pentagram, wearing robes and using objects such as swords, wands and cups, before eventually removing their clothing as part of the ceremony itself. Something he claimed symbolised a loss of power or influence within the ritual. And even more notably, he stated that this was not a one-off event, but something that had been taking place in Hopwas Woods since at least 1972, which means that for over a decade these gatherings have been happening without attention, without interruption, and without anyone outside of that group knowing they were taking place. Which raises a fairly obvious question. Because if something like that had happened for that long without being noticed, then what exactly changed on that night in 1984? What was it that caused them to be discovered? All 16 were arrested and taken into custody, and what had initially been described as a ritual quickly became a criminal case, with several members admitting to possession of cannabis, including around 4 grams and a number of pre-rolled joints that were found nearby. Now, it's important to remember that this was 1984, back in a time that you could get banged up for 6 months for having a teenth in your back pocket. They later appeared before magistrates, where the group was fined a combined total of around £2,000, along with court costs of a tenner, bringing a very real and very ordinary legal conclusion to something that had already been presented in a far more unusual way. But despite that outcome, the detail that stayed with people wasn't the charges or the fines, or even the explanation that had been given by those involved, but the image itself and the label that had already taken hold. Because once the word witches had been attached to the story, that became the version that stuck, regardless of what was later clarified or corrected. Lees later stated that the group would be leaving the area, and that part of Hopwas Woods that they'd used would be considered desecrated and would not be used again, which, depending on how you interpret it, either marks a clear end to what had been happening there, or raises further questions about what they believed had taken place. Because if the ritual was part of something ongoing, and if it was meant to prevent something that was still yet to happen, then it leaves open the question of whether they believed it had already worked, or whether it had simply been interrupted before it could be completed. And that is where the story becomes difficult to fully close. Because while the arrests can be explained and so can the charges, and even the people involved, what can't be explained is intent, and whether what took place in these woods was exactly as it appeared to be, or something that was never fully understood once it was exposed. So now, when you walk through Hopwas Woods, it's easy to see it as it is today. Quiet, ordinary, and no different to any other stretch of countryside. But for a brief moment in 1984, it became the setting for something that was interpreted in a very different way, depending on who was telling the story. And even now, the version that people remember says far more about perception than it does about what actually happened. So what do you think, guys? Witches, weirdos, or hippies?